Today, we're going to talk about something completely different. I want to talk about a brand new product from Microsoft called Data API Builder. And I think this is a really interesting topic, and it also fits the theme quite well, because we're going to be talking about connecting your client to the API, connecting your API to the database, stuff like that. And why is this such an interesting thing to talk about? Why do you need to know about Data API Builder? Well, that's because it fixes a very boring part of our jobs, or a very boring thing that we constantly have to keep doing. And there's different products on the market that also solve this issue, but I really think that Data API Builder is the one you should use. So today we're going to talk about what this problem is, what Data API Builder is, how can you use it, in what scenarios should you use it, and all kinds of features and stuff like this. And I think we should get started. So, my name is Brinke. I'm a senior software engineer at Arcadie. So I do a lot of stuff with .NET, I do a lot of stuff with Azure, a bit of DevOps, stuff like this. I'm also a Microsoft MVP, so I also really like to do blogging, speaking. I'm a host on some podcasts. So if you're interested in any of that, you can find these links there. You'll also find them at the end of the presentation. And let's just move right on to the agenda. So I split this up into 4 different pieces. We're going to talk first about building boring APIs, so what does that mean? Next, we're going to talk about Data API Builder. I'm going to do a little demo so you can kind of really grasp what I'm trying to say here, and so you understand everything. Next, we're going to talk about its integration with Azure Static Web Apps, and we're going to do a little demo of that as well. And finally, we'll be finishing up with some roadmap information, conclusions, some more resources, stuff like this. I really enjoy making these talks kind of interactive, so if you have any thoughts or questions or like, hey, I recognize this from something else and stuff like this, please feel free to share. Let's make it very interactive, very fun. So questions do not need to wait until the end. Okay, so building boring APIs. What do I mean? Right, so I see a boring API kind of like just your average data API. So you might have a very simple, but maybe also a complex client that does a lot of stuff, but all it needs to do is basically talk to an API which talks to the database. So imagine just kind of, like a CRUD scenario, like create, read, update, delete. Your API maybe does 1 or 2 special things, but if you look at it from a different perspective, all it is just kind of a database wrapper. You might be using REST, you might be using GraphQL, but it's not like, it's not rocket science. We also kind of, if you want to think of examples, there's things like a simple fitness tracking app where you can maybe like track your records or your goals and stuff like this. It's just posting data to the server, showing it in a list. Maybe a simple inventory management app so you can kind of, manage all the things that you have still in stock. Maybe some customer support ticketing system where someone calls, you put it in the system, you read it back, you finish the tickets. These things are not all that complex. All they do is talk to a database. The database stuff is stored and retrieved again. And this is all fine and good. There's nothing wrong with building these kind of applications. But the steps to set these things up and to also make them reliable, there's a lot of stuff happening here, right? We need to create a repository, right? We need to set up the folder structure, set up basic documentation. We all do that, hopefully. You need to choose your framework. You need to choose your language. You need to set up like the project skeleton, right? We need to choose your architecture of the week, clean, vertical, hexagonal, etc. And then finally, at that point, we've kind of arrived at the database connection. So we're setting up your connection to the database with your favorite frameworks, Prism, I think, in JavaScript, or Entity Framework Core in .NET. You're using migration, so you can migrate your databases. Loads of stuff is happening here, writing endpoints, CI/CD, deployment. But that's not really it. In the end, you still need to manage. You need to manage this application. You need to install those package updates. You need to get rid of those security vulnerabilities. If the front end needs a little bit more data, you're going to need to update this kind of boring API and just return a bit more data. It's a lot of work for something that shouldn't be so complex. We're just writing a wrapper around a little database, and we need to do and spend a lot of time on this kind of stuff. And I just think that's too much. So to fix this, Microsoft released a product called Data API Builder. And what it essentially is, it's an open source product. It's built by Microsoft. And what it will do is it will basically, at runtime, it will generate an API for you based on the database you've connected to it. So if you just kind of compare us to earlier, right, we have our client, but instead of having our own custom-built API, we just have DAB running there, Data API Builder. And this is not a framework. This is not a coding tool. This is really just it's just an executable that you're running, or a Docker image, stuff like this. And it connects to your database. So imagine that you have a database with like books and authors. What the result of this will be is REST and GraphQL endpoints, which is really, really cool. And you can then call like API/books to get the books, API/authors. You can post, put, delete, all kinds of entities. And all of these features that I talked about before, they're all implemented for you. So this really eliminates that need to build those simple APIs, because all of that stuff is just, you get that out of the box. And usually, my worry with these kind of products are that they're just not really, really good. Like, this is not a unique product on the market, right? Like, if you compare this to something that already exists, you might be thinking of things like Firebase. So Google has Firebase, which allows you to kind of have a database as an API, as a service. So you can just kind of have some data stored, and then you get endpoints that get and use that data. But there is a bit of vendor lock-in happening there, because you really are using the Google Cloud, so you have to use Google stuff. And sometimes there's also the problem of just not having enough features. Like, yes, it's cool that we get some endpoints, but the second you want to do something a little bit complex, like caching or more authentication and authorization, you're out of luck and you're building custom stuff again. And I just really like that that is not the case with Data API Builder. So again, it exposes a database via REST and GraphQL, and there's loads of database support, right? So we have SQL Server, Azure SQL, Cosmos DB, Postgres, MySQL, stuff like this. So the biggest databases are supported. And then there's things like filtering, sorting, and pagination. They're all built in. These are the things that you always build in a custom way. You just get these out of the box. It has authentication support, it has caching support, and there's loads of custom things to do here. So it will work in your scenario. Next, there's also OpenAPI and Swagger. I really am a big fan of this kind of stuff. I released a new blog post about this last week, if you're interested in this kind of thing. And finally, there's also a GraphQL Explorer, which is built with Hot Chocolate, which is a very popular library for this in .NET. So if you're a big fan of GraphQL, it's just out of the box, you get it. Next, you might be thinking, well, how does this work? Well, you get tables, views, and stored procedure support. So if you have, you can just map endpoints to tables, you can map endpoints to views and stored procedures, which kind of allow you to also do a little bit of complex stuff in your views and stored procedures, if you want to do that. But there's loads of opportunities here. And I think the killer scenario for DAB is that it can be used on-premise and that it has Docker support. So if you want to run this on your on-premise like Linux server, on your on-premise Windows server, you can do so. If you want to use this with an on-premise database, go ahead. If you want to use a database that's hosted in the Google Cloud, Azure, AWS, it's all fine. And I think that makes it really, really useful for loads of scenarios. Of course, there is a little bit of Azure tie-in here if you want to use it. Like, there's a really good Azure Static Web Apps integration, which we're going to talk about as well. And it also has support for application insights. But you're not required to use those. They don't make the product any worse if you don't choose to use them. What else can I say? Well, just to end the overview here, like, this product is built with a lot of other open source products under the hood. So you're getting like ASP.NET Core, which is used to create those endpoints. You're getting Hot Chocolate for the GraphQL side of things. You're getting Fusion Cache for the caching, which is really, really nice, because that means that over time, when those projects get updated, they will also be updated in Data API Builder, and you just get those updates for free. There's nothing custom built here that is kind of difficult to understand. It's all pretty understandable if you're going to look at the source code. Okay, so just to kind of emphasize the point, this is not a framework or coding tool. This is just like an executable that will create this server for you. So to kind of show you how this works and how easy it is to get started, we first have to install it. So there's multiple ways to do this. In this example, I'm just using the .NET installer. So we're saying .NET tool install, Microsoft Data API Builder, and we want to install it globally. Next, we need to initialize it. So we say dab, init or initialize. We want to initialize it for a data type connection for Microsoft SQL Server, and the connection string will be stored in an environment variable. We could also just put it in there, but it's a bit more insecure, so storing it in an environment variable is just a better idea. Next, we get an entity. So now we can say dab add book. That's an entity we want to start exposing from your database. By default, nothing gets exposed. And now we can say, well, the source of that is DBO books. That's the schema and the table. And the permissions are anonymous star. That means that anyone can do anything. You probably don't want to do this, but it kind of drives the point home of the permission system as well, because you have multiple roles like anonymous and authenticated, or you can have custom roles like maybe librarian, administrator. And with the star, you can replace with things like create, read, update, delete. So you can also make it very easy to have specific roles be allowed to do specific actions, something that when building it yourself is quite a lot of work. Next, you can simply start it. So you can say dab start, and maybe like in a second, maybe a few milliseconds, you will just get your API, and you can say curl, go to localhost 5001 API books, and this will return in JSON the contents of that book table to you. I think this is really, really nice. Instead of having to build all of this custom stuff with like 5 calls, we are done and we are running this cool API. So we're going to do a little demo of this in a few slides, but I kind of want to show to you the configuration file as well, because when you do dab init, you end up with just a single JSON file, and that is all you need to do and run this piece of software. And this configuration file has 4 different sections. It uses JSON schema under the hood, so it's really nice with an editing experience with IntelliSense and stuff like this. So first you get your data source. So this is, well, the settings for your database connection. So how should Data API Builder connect to your database? There's also data source files, which allow you to connect one instance of Data API Builder to multiple databases. So you could, for example, say, I have like 20 databases in my entire enterprise, and probably way more. And I don't really want to have to run 20 instances of DAB. I just want to have one. Well, then you can say, well, I want to grab the user entity from Postgres. I want to grab the orders from Cosmos DB. I want to grab, I don't know, user preferences from MySQL, stuff like this. So you can have one instance of DAB with multiple connection types. Runtime options, caching, REST, GraphQL, host, telemetry. There's loads of things to tweak here and loads of things to be happy with. And finally, there's entities. And this is the one that you'll probably be editing the most. So for example, your entity exposure, like what entities do I want to create endpoints for? So books, authors, stuff like this. Next, there's relationships, which we're going to talk about as well. So how are my relationships defined? For example, a user probably has orders. And then it would also be nice to be able to retrieve all the users with their orders instead of having to do like 20 different calls to different tables and then join them together yourself. DAB can do this for you with GraphQL. There's permissions, which I talked a little bit about before, like what users are allowed to perform what actions. And finally, there's mappings, which is, well, maybe you have like a book number column in your database, but you want to map it to a book ID in your API, so you can kind of map things differently. So let's take a look at a simple entity. Is this readable for everyone in the back? Yeah? All great, thank you. So this is all the configuration that was just created when we ran those commands, at least a part of it. So we end up with an entity called book, which has a source, which is the books table. GraphQL is enabled for this entity with some type information. We're going to just skip over that for now. It's just for like the relationships kind of thing. There's REST options. So REST is also enabled for this entity. You can enable these kind of things globally or per entity. And finally, there's your permissions. So here we say the role anonymous has actions, wildcard, so anything. I think this is pretty readable. I think this is you can easily do this using your CLI, but it's also really easy to just edit this in the JSON itself if you want to do so. Next, let's talk about the ways to use the generated APIs. Again, because it's just a tool that we're using and not a tool that we're like coding, it kind of, it either thrives or dies depending on how good the user experience is from this tool. So the first way you can use this is just REST endpoints, right? So we can use get API books, post API books, or you can get a specific book, or like create or update a specific book, patch, delete, all this kind of stuff is just supported. But there's more. Because we also have OData. Is someone here not familiar with OData? Okay. Yeah, okay, the management in the back. So management in the back, OData is, no. So what you can basically do with OData is it is a standard which is really popular in Microsoft products and allows you to have really common API operations are already implemented for you. So these things you might look at and think, oh, I usually implement these in my day-to-day job. OData will just do that for you. So you can say select, so like a query parameters, $select ID title means I want all the books, but only the ID and the title. You can also have filter, which allows you to write like where statements. I want all the books where the title contains, I don't know, Game of Thrones. You can also have order by, first and after, so for your pagination, stuff like this. And you don't need to have this in your server. You can easily do this on the client, but this, of course, promises a lot better performance and just easier client usage if you can do all this stuff on the server. Well, and I think it actually translates this stuff to SQL as well, if I remember correctly. So it's really, really efficient. And finally, there's GraphQL. So GraphQL is a little bit different than REST, whereas with REST, you're just doing a call to the server and you get the same data back as always. You always get the ID, the title, and maybe the number of pages, author information, stuff like this. But what if you wanted a little bit more data, or if you wanted less data? Well, then with REST, you're kind of stuck. Either you need to just ignore the fact that you've got way too much data and it's just kind of a waste of bandwidth, or you need to do multiple calls to multiple entities and join them together on your client. It's kind of a problem where GraphQL was invented for. So with GraphQL, the client decides exactly what they want to get returned. So you can have a query that says, I want all the books, but only an ID and a title. And this kind of stuff is pretty advanced. It's already kind of a few years old. I think in 2018, 2019, it got really popular. But implementing this in .NET is not very easy. But you just get it out of the box for free. OK, relationships. So this is only supported for GraphQL. But this is really, really useful and for me kind of a necessary thing to have in this kind of product. So what if I want to say I want to have all the book series, but only the name, and all the books connected to that series, but only the title? Like in your REST API, you're not going to implement such a specific endpoint. So that means that the client is either not going to have enough data or it's going to have too much. And this is pretty complex, but it's super simple to do this with Data API Builder. We can simply go ahead and say, dab, update the series entity that we might have created before. We can say, I want to create a new relationship called books. The target of this relationship is the book entity we've configured earlier. And the cardinality is many. So one series has many books. And you can see there's one to many to one, many to many. There's loads of things to be happy with here. And in the end, what this will do is this will create the following JSON, which is really, really readable. So we're going to get the series entity with a relationship called books, with a target entity of book and a cardinality of many. And that's it. Now you can perform this query and everything will be well and all the data will be queried efficiently. OK. In the next slide, we're going to go through a little bit of a demo, but just to kind of summarize what I've talked to you about, I want to kind of show you the architecture overview here. So Data API Builder is in the middle, right? What you input is a configuration file that you can just use the CLI for or edit by hand. And you also, in the configuration file, specify your relational schema or your GraphQL schema. So if you're using like Cosmos DB with the NoSQL variant, you need to supply a GraphQL schema, which is a bit too advanced to talk more about now. But the more easy version to understand is your relational schema. So that's kind of the connection string to your database. You put that in at runtime, it will generate these endpoints for you. It will generate the OpenAPI document. You'll get health endpoints, caching, GraphQL, and that's also what's output, right? So the output is REST endpoints, GraphQL endpoints. Let's handle a couple of scenarios. Some questions that you might still be thinking in your head or that might start you thinking, well, about these kind of things when I tell you about it. So what if I want to run custom code? Right? What if my product owner tells to me, that's great, but when a book gets created, you need to do a call to this validation service and only then create the book in the database. That is not currently possible with DAB. They were thinking of adding like the options that you could extend the generated code with your own code, but that's currently not an option and I haven't seen it on the roadmap. But what they do recommend, and what I also recommend, is that you can do the following. So for like 99% of cases, most of your requests can probably go through Data API Builder, right? So like getting the books, getting the authors, maybe creating a new author. That's all not exciting. But what you can do is you can say, well, when a user performs a request to create a new book, you can hang something like API management or YARP or whatever tool in front of Data API Builder, and instead send that to an Azure function. And what an Azure function is, it's basically a serverless, serverless service from Azure. And it allows you to write a function in C#, in JavaScript, in Python, whatever. And in this case, this function could take in an incoming HTTP request and then call a validation service and then insert the book into the database. That would only be maybe like 10 lines of code or something like this. And you could easily kind of add a couple more Azure functions over time if needed. But then for 99% of cases, you can use Data API Builder, and you don't need to start building an entire custom API just to call this little validation service. I think this is something that could work really well. Yeah?
Should you not, it's maybe an idea to just go from Azure Function then to Data API Builder again, or do you think?
Oh, that's a good point. Yeah, your question, so Martijn's question was, wouldn't it be smart to kind of go from Azure Functions to Data API Builder? Yeah. That's a really good point. Yeah, I haven't thought about that. I'm going to update my slides for next week. I think that's a really good point. Yeah, exactly. So instead of like doing all the logic to create the book, we can just go directly to here. You could definitely do something like that. Yeah, that's a good thing. In this case, yeah, kinda. Yeah, that's a good point. Okay. So yeah, to kind of summarize this, I really think that this is really powerful. Like 90% of your requests just follow the bottom line, and it's just zero code written by you. And in the cases where you do need a little bit of custom stuff, you can just write a little Azure function or an AWS Lambda or whatever Google has to offer, because this is not Azure only. I just want to stress that. This can run anywhere. And then you're just, going on with your life. Again, also think about the fact that if you're going to be writing like thousands of Azure functions, you might want to build your custom API, but this can work in a lot of scenarios. So what if I want to deal with events? So what if your manager tells you, okay, when a book is created, I want to email the author that the book is inserted in our system. You could do the following path, but you could also go ahead and say, well, a request comes in a Data API Builder to create a book. We insert it into the database. And now Azure Functions can also have a SQL trigger. So when a new row is added to the database, I want to run a bit of code. And Azure Function could then simply email the author. Again, this is a bit of custom stuff, but it's a whole lot less custom stuff than having to create an entire API in ASP.NET Core and managing it and keep maintaining it and hosting it somewhere versus this. I think these are really good things to start thinking about. Finally, I want to talk a little about security on the feature side of things. So what if you want to secure your application? Like, it's really good that you can just retrieve books and post books and stuff like this, but like not everyone is allowed to just create books or delete books. That would not work very well. So you probably want to secure some of your endpoints. And how does that work? So what the team recommends is that you could be using API management in front of Data API Builder, but that's not required. You can also just expose Data API Builder on the internet. That's not a problem at all. It's very secure. But if you do, then you can already handle authentication at the API management layer. If you choose to not do that, then you're going to be looking at Data API Builder's features for this kind of stuff. So you have authentication. There's 3 options. So first you have Easy Auth, which is the authentication mechanism from Azure Static Web Apps and Azure App Service. So if you're already using that to log people in, then that token and the role will just flow into Data API Builder. There's also Entra ID, formerly known as Azure Active Directory, which can then also just work. So lots of people, including us at Arcadia, we're using Entra, so you can just kind of connect all the Arcadia employees can already log in, and their token will just flow into Data API Builder, and then all of your roles in our systems will just work. And finally, there's JSON Web Token support. So what if you're running like your custom authentication server, like you're running your own version of identity server, maybe you're using like Auth0 and some other ones that I might not know. Well, they're not in this list, but they are supported because there's just generic support for JSON Web Token, so anything will work. So now that we know that the user is allowed to enter the system, how can we ensure that they're only performing actions that they are allowed to do? So for this, there's the anonymous and authenticated roles, which we've already seen before. Authenticated basically means your token is valid. So you can imagine a scenario where maybe you only want to allow the user to retrieve books after logging in. So that's already covered in this scenario. You can also have custom roles. So if you have custom roles defined in your authentication provider, they'll flow with your token into your Data API Builder instance. So let's say that you have a role called librarian that will be in the role claim. And now in your permission file that we talked about earlier, if you say librarian create, then it will know that, hey, this user is a librarian, so this user is allowed to perform the create action. Next, there's item security, and I always get these two confused, so I'm just going to have to take a little look. Write a little bit of code, or we want to have a policy where anonymous users are only allowed to see data that isn't archived, or books that aren't archived. Because currently, if you go to API/books, you see all the books. So with item security, you can write policies for certain permissions. So we can say for anonymous, I only want to return the books where is archived is false. And then it will just flow into the query to Data API Builder, and those kind of users will not see data that they're not allowed to do. They're not allowed to see. And finally, there's field security. So let's say that we are having a customer support system. Let's kind of switch it up from the books. And in this case, we have like the customer information, but also a customer notes field, right? So employees can write little notes about the contact they had with a customer. We don't want the customer to see this information. There's probably some bad stuff in there. So with field security, you can specify what fields are returned for specific permissions. So we can say that customer can see, I don't know, first name, last name, and address, but the customer support role can also get the customer notes field returned. And this is kind of an easy way to modify the data we're returning to the client and secure your application. Does that kind of answer your question about the security kind of part?
Yeah, a bit.
Okay, okay, good. It's 8 minutes, okay. I'm going to have to hurry up a little bit. So finally, there's session context as well. So if you want to use session context in Azure SQL or SQL Server, it's a kind of an advanced scenario to flow your authorization token into your query and then do a lot of advanced querying in your database. You can use that. Okay. How can I host Data API Builder? There's an executable. There's a .NET tool that you can install, but I recommend using Docker because there's a Docker image available. And when you're using Docker, there's loads of options. So don't forget that you can run this on-premise on your own Kubernetes cluster, on Docker Swarm, or just on a Docker container, like a Docker host like Podman or Docker, doesn't really matter. But you can also use this in Azure, AWS, Google Cloud, stuff like this. Okay. I have around, well, probably 6 minutes left, so I want to kind of go through this one. I kind of talked about all of the features of Data API Builder and how easy it is to use, how secure it is, how you can handle some more advanced scenarios. I'm giving you a demo. I just quickly want to talk about its integration with Azure Static Web Apps. So Azure Static Web Apps, I'm not going to go through all of these points, is a service from Microsoft that is the service to host your static web app application. So you can think of things like Hugo and Jekyll that just generate static sites, but you can also use this to host like Vue and React and Angular, Next.js, stuff like this. And this service is really, really cool. It has easy API integration. It's free. It has free SSL certificates. Unlike app services, it's really, really cheap. And there's loads of other features. But we're not here to learn about static web apps. We're here to learn about Data API Builder. So let's say that we have a scenario where we want to host a static web app and that has to talk to one of our APIs. So where do we host our API? Well, we can probably write something custom, right? Like we could write a custom app service or an Azure function, but then we're just creating a data API again. So we could then choose to create an Azure container app, which is Azure service for running a Docker image, and then we could host DAB in there. But for this, we're probably creating more bicep, infra as code. We need to do a lot of Azure stuff again, which is also just a whole lot of work that we don't really want to be doing. So that is why there's integration. So Azure Static Web Apps has DAB integrated into it. So what you can say is when the user goes to /API, we go to one of our custom code options. For example, the Azure functions we've talked about. And this is just for advanced scenarios and then flows into your database. But for all other scenarios, for 90% of your cases, you just go to /data API, /API/books, and then this will just all be done. Data API Builder will just be hosted for you under the hood, and it makes it very, very easy to architect your applications and to think differently about how do I want to build APIs for all of my applications. Because 90% of the time, you're just getting information. And that doesn't need a custom API. That can just be a data API. And for everything else, you can still go to your Kubernetes cluster or to wherever you're running your real advanced enterprise kind of stuff. How this works exactly, I kind of want to skip over now. It's kind of the same as using the, well, that's the thing as before. We install the Static Web Apps CLI. We initialize it for SQL Server with a connection string. And we start it up with a data API location in a folder. And that configuration file is the same file as Data API Builder. And now in your front end, or wherever you're hosting it, you can go to /data API/API/books, and you will get the JSON from the books again. But this is now all managed by Azure. You're not having to run your own instance of DAB or have to host it on Linux or Windows or whatever. It's all done in Azure for you. So first, the conclusion. So Data API Builder is an ideal replacement for simple data APIs. It's easy to use, it's feature-rich, it's secure, it's open source, which I think is really, really cool for Microsoft to do, and it really runs everywhere. Extending it is also very easy, combined with other cloud services or on-premise services if you choose to do so. And finally, it has integration with Azure Static Web Apps to just really make it easy to build web applications that might be complex or easy, and like within seconds integrate them with your data. The roadmap. So it became generally available the 1st of May, which is like a month and a half ago. So it's like very new, but it's completely feature complete, and there's like no bugs in it and stuff like this. This is Microsoft's policies on how they release software. There's going to be hot reload support soon. They want to have more OData support. There's Azure App Service integration coming, which is a very popular platform in Azure. So you can just make use of this pretty soon. And finally, there's going to be loads and loads of other things. If you feel free to take a picture of this if you're interested. So there's links to documentation, the videos that they do, the source code, which you can find on GitHub, the samples, and if you're interested, you can find my demo as well on my GitHub page. And that's everything. So I really want to thank you for attending today. I really want to thank you for some questions, and let me know if there's some more.